Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are taking you on a nightmare journey down America's highways and back roads with 10 most disturbing true road trip horror stories. These harrowing accounts come directly from travelers who encountered terror on what should have been ordinary trips across our nation. Each story represents a genuine experience shared by real people who faced unimaginable horror while simply trying to get from point A to point B. We have verified these testimonies through witness statements, police reports, and first-hand interviews to bring you the most authentic collection of highway nightmares ever assembled. From desert encounters that defy explanation to predators who hunt along interstate corridors, these stories will forever change how you view that next rest stop or lonely stretch of road. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will chill you to the bone. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we bring you the darkness that lurks just beyond your headlights. Now buckle up and lock your doors as we journey into the terrifying reality of what can happen when the road ahead leads straight into hell. Back in the summer of 2019, my name is Jackson, and I was 22 years old with absolutely no idea that a simple cross-country road trip would become the most terrifying experience of my entire life. I had just graduated from college with a degree in marketing, and my best friends Princeton and Camden had convinced me to take one last adventure before we all started our adult careers. We decided to rent an RV and drive from our hometown in Ohio all the way to California, taking the scenic route through some of America's most remote and beautiful landscapes. Princeton was the planner of our group, always had been since high school. He mapped out our entire route, making sure we would hit all the major national parks and scenic byways. Camden was our designated driver for most of the trip since he had experience driving larger vehicles from his summer job at a moving company. I was just along for the ride, excited to see parts of the country I had only seen in movies and documentaries. We were young, invincible, and completely unprepared for what waited for us in the desert. The RV we rented was a 30-foot Winnebago, nothing fancy, but it had everything we needed for 2 weeks on the road. 3 beds, a small kitchen, bathroom, and enough storage space for our camping gear and supplies. Princeton had loaded it up with enough food to feed a small army, while Camden brought his collection of survival gear that he swore we would need in case of emergencies. I brought my camera equipment, hoping to document our adventure and maybe create some content for social media. Everything went perfectly for the first week. We drove through Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Tennessee, and into Arkansas without any problems. The RV handled beautifully, we were making good time, and the weather was perfect. We stopped at small towns along the way, met friendly locals, and took hundreds of photos of breathtaking landscapes. By the time we reached Oklahoma, we were feeling like seasoned road warriors, completely confident in our ability to handle whatever the road threw at us. The problem started when we decided to take a detour through New Mexico and Arizona instead of staying on the main interstate highways. Princeton had read about this scenic route that would take us through some incredible desert landscapes, an authentic Native American territory. The guidebook he was using described it as one of the most beautiful and untouched stretches of highway in the Southwest, perfect for adventurous travelers looking to experience the real America. We entered New Mexico on a Tuesday afternoon and immediately noticed how different the landscape became. Gone were the rolling hills and green forests we had grown accustomed to. Instead, we were surrounded by vast expanses of red rock formations, towering mesas, and endless stretches of desert that seemed to go on forever in every direction. The isolation was both beautiful and slightly unnerving, especially as we realized that we had not seen another vehicle for over an hour. The highway we were traveling on was a 2-lane road that cut straight through the heart of the desert. There were no gas stations, no rest stops, no signs of civilization whatsoever. According to our GPS, the next town was still over 100 miles away. Princeton assured us that this was normal for this part of the country and that we had plenty of fuel to make it to our next planned stop. Camden was getting a little nervous about driving such a large vehicle on such narrow roads, but the pavement was in good condition and visibility was excellent. As the sun began to set, we started looking for a place to pull over and set up camp for the night. We had been driving for almost 8 hours straight, and everyone was getting tired. About 20 miles outside of a small town called Shiprock, we found a dirt road that led to what appeared to be an abandoned rest area. There were concrete picnic tables, fire pits, and even restroom facilities, though they had clearly not been maintained for several years. The location was perfect for our needs. We were far enough off the main highway that we would not be disturbed by any passing traffic, but close enough that we could easily get back on the road in the morning. The landscape around us was absolutely stunning, with massive red rock formations creating a natural amphitheater around our campsite. Princeton immediately started taking pictures, while Camden began setting up our outdoor furniture and starting a fire in one of the existing fire pits. I was inside the RV preparing dinner when I first noticed something strange. It was just after sunset, and the desert had taken on that ethereal purple glow that photographers love to capture. I was looking out the window above the sink when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there, just empty desert and rock formations. I convinced myself that it was probably just a coyote or some other desert animal and went back to cooking. Dinner was delicious, and we spent the evening sitting around the fire, sharing stories and planning the next day's drive. The desert night was absolutely silent, except for the occasional distant howl of coyotes and the crackling of our fire. The stars were more brilliant than any of us had ever seen, and we spent hours just lying on our backs, looking up at the Milky Way. By 11 o'clock, we were all exhausted and ready for bed. That was when the scratching started. At first, it was so subtle that I thought I might be imagining it. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails on wood, coming from somewhere above my head. I was lying in the bed that was positioned over the driver's cab while Princeton and Camden were in the beds further back in the RV. I listened carefully for several minutes, trying to determine if the sound was real or if I was just hearing the RV settling as the desert air cooled. The scratching continued, definitely real, definitely coming from the roof directly above where I was lying. It moved in a deliberate pattern, starting at one end of the RV and slowly traveling toward the other end, as if something was walking across the roof. But that made no sense. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any trees that an animal could have climbed to get on top of the RV. The scratching was too loud and too purposeful to be caused by the wind. I called out softly to Princeton and Camden, asking if they could hear it too. Princeton mumbled something about probably being a raccoon or possum, while Camden suggested that it might be a branch or piece of debris that had gotten stuck on the roof during our drive. Neither of them seemed particularly concerned, and both quickly fell back asleep. But I remained wide awake, listening to the scratching sounds that continued for almost an hour before finally stopping. The next morning, Camden climbed up on the roof to investigate while Princeton and I cleaned up our campsite. He found absolutely nothing that could have caused the sounds we heard. No scratches in the RV's fiberglass roof, no debris, no animal tracks in the dust that had accumulated up there. The roof was completely clean and undamaged. We all agreed that it was probably just the RV expanding and contracting as the temperature changed, and we hit the road again without giving it much more thought. The second night was worse. We had driven deeper into Arizona following a highway that seemed to get more isolated with every mile. We had not seen another vehicle all day, and our cell phones had lost signal hours earlier. As evening approached, we found another abandoned rest area similar to the one from the previous night. This one was even more remote, surrounded by towering red sandstone formations that created the feeling of being in a vast outdoor cathedral. The scratching started again around midnight, but this time it was much more aggressive. Instead of the subtle scraping sounds from the night before, this sounded like claws digging into the fiberglass roof. The sounds moved back and forth across the entire length of the RV, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always deliberate and purposeful. Princeton and Camden were both awake this time, and all three of us lay in our beds, listening to whatever was moving around above us. Camden whispered that we should go outside and investigate, but Princeton firmly vetoed that idea. He said that whatever was up there might be dangerous, and that we should wait until morning to figure out what was going on. I agreed with Princeton, mainly because the thought of going outside in the dark desert to confront an unknown animal terrified me. We spent the rest of the night taking turns keeping watch, but none of us saw anything when we looked out the windows. Morning brought another thorough inspection of the roof, and once again, Camden found absolutely nothing. This time, however, he did find something disturbing around the perimeter of our campsite. In the soft sand around the RV, there were footprints, but they were not animal prints, and they were definitely not human. They looked almost human in shape, but they were much larger than any human foot should be, with what appeared to be claw marks extending from each toe. The prints formed a complete circle around the RV, as if something had spent the night walking around and around our vehicle. Some of the prints were so close to the RV that whatever made them would have been able to reach out and touch the sides. The thought of something stalking us while we slept was absolutely terrifying, and we immediately began packing up our campsite. As we prepared to leave, Princeton made a discovery that chilled us to the bone. On the back bumper of the RV, written in what looked like mud or clay, were symbols that none of us recognized. They looked almost like Native American petroglyphs, but cruder and more primitive. The symbols had definitely not been there the previous evening when we set up camp. Someone or something had marked our RV during the night. The third night was when everything went completely wrong. We had driven almost 300 miles that day, desperate to get as far away as possible from whatever had been stalking us. We reached a small town called Window Rock just before sunset. When we tried to find a motel or campground, we discovered that everything was either full or closed for renovations. The only option was to find another isolated spot to spend the night, something none of us wanted to do but which seemed unavoidable. About 10 miles outside of town, we found what appeared to be a legitimate campground with concrete pads, electrical hookups, and maintained restroom facilities. There was even a small general store, though it was closed for the evening. The campground was completely empty except for us, which should have been our first warning sign. But we were exhausted and running low on fresh water, so we decided to risk one more night in the desert. The scratching started earlier this time, just after sunset while we were still awake and moving around inside the RV. But it was not just scratching anymore. We could hear what sounded like voices, muffled and distorted, coming from outside the RV. The voices seemed to be mimicking sounds that we had made earlier, playing back conversations we had had during the day, but the words were wrong somehow, twisted and unnatural. Princeton grabbed his flashlight and announced that he was going outside to see what was happening. Camden and I both tried to stop him, but he was determined to solve the mystery once and for all. He opened the RV door and stepped outside, shining his flashlight beam in all directions. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Princeton started screaming. Through the windows, we could see Princeton running, back toward the RV, his flashlight beam swinging wildly as he sprinted across the campground. Behind him, caught in the edge of the light beam, we could see something pursuing him. It was humanoid in shape but moved in a way that no human ever could, covering ground in impossible leaping bounds that seemed to defy gravity. Princeton reached the RV and threw himself inside, slamming the door behind him and immediately turning all the locks. He was hyperventilating and could barely speak, but he managed to tell us what he had seen. The thing chasing him had looked human from a distance, but up close it was clearly something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent in the wrong directions, and its face was a horrible mixture of human and animal features. That was when we realized that the voices we had been hearing were not just random sounds. They were our voices, exact recordings of conversations we had been having all day, played back to us by something that had been listening and learning. Whatever was stalking us had been studying us, preparing for this moment when we were most vulnerable. The attacks on the RV became increasingly violent throughout the night. Whatever was outside was trying to get in, clawing at the walls, pounding on the roof, and testing every possible entry point. At one point, something grabbed the electrical cable connecting us to the campground hookup and began pulling the entire RV back and forth, rocking us violently from side to side. Camden tried to start the RV engine so we could drive away, but nothing happened when he turned the key. We checked under the hood and discovered that several critical engine components had been removed or destroyed. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere with something inhuman stalking us, and our only shelter was a recreational vehicle that was being systematically attacked by a creature that seemed to possess impossible strength and intelligence. Just before dawn, everything suddenly stopped. The scratching, the voices, the violent rocking of the RV, all of it ceased, as if someone had thrown a switch. We waited inside for over an hour before finally working up the courage to look outside. The campground appeared completely normal, with no sign of the creature that had terrorized us all night. A passing highway patrol officer found us later that morning and helped us get the RV towed to the nearest town for repairs. When we described our experience to the mechanic, his face went pale and he immediately recommended that we leave the area as quickly as possible. He told us that what we had encountered was something that the local Native American tribes had been warning people about for centuries, and that we were lucky to have survived the encounter. We never found out exactly what had stalked us for those 3 nights in the desert. The mechanic refused to discuss it in detail, and the few locals we spoke with would only shake their heads and advise us to never return to that part of the country. We cut our road trip short and drove straight home to Ohio, grateful to be alive and vowing never to travel through that region again. To this day, none of us can fully explain what happened during those 3 nights in the New Mexico and Arizona desert, but I know that somewhere in that vast wilderness, something inhuman is still stalking travelers who ventured too far from civilization. And I know that I will never forget the sound of our own voices being played back to us by something that should not exist. My name is Sam, and at 43 years old, I had been driving long-haul trucks for over 20 years when I encountered something that nearly ended my career and my life. I had always prided myself on being one of the most experienced and safety-conscious drivers on the road. I knew every major truck stop, every dangerous stretch of highway, and every trick that criminals used to target truckers. But in September of 2018, I learned that sometimes experience and caution are not enough to protect you from the monsters that hunt along America's highways. I was hauling a load of electronics from a warehouse in Ohio to a distribution center in Phoenix, a route I had driven dozens of times over the years. It was a straightforward run that normally took me about 36 hours of driving time spread over 4 days, with mandatory rest stops to comply with Department of Transportation regulations. I was driving a 2017 Freightliner Cascadia, pulling a 53-foot trailer, a reliable combination that had never given me any serious problems. The first 3 days of the trip went exactly as planned. I made good time through Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and into Oklahoma without any complications. The weather was perfect, traffic was light, and I was actually running about 2 hours ahead of schedule. By the evening of the 3rd day, I was feeling confident that I would complete the delivery early and maybe even have time to visit an old friend who lived near Phoenix. That confidence disappeared when I stopped at a truck stop outside of Amarillo, Texas. The place was called Desert Wind Travel Plaza, a large facility that catered specifically to long-haul truckers. It had everything we needed: diesel fuel, a restaurant, shower facilities, a small convenience store, and parking for about 50 trucks. I had stopped there many times over the years and always found it to be well-maintained and professionally operated. The staff was friendly, the food was decent, and the security was better than most places along that route. I pulled into the parking area around 9 o'clock in the evening, planning to fuel up, grab a quick dinner, and get some sleep before completing the final leg of my journey the next morning. The parking lot was about half full, which was normal for that time of night. I found a spot near the back of the lot where I would have plenty of room to maneuver in the morning, and went through my normal routine of checking my load securement and doing a basic inspection of my truck. That was when I first noticed the blue sedan. It was parked at the edge of the truck parking area, which was unusual because regular passenger vehicles were supposed to use the separate car parking section near the main building. The car appeared to be occupied, though I could not see clearly through the tinted windows. Something about the situation felt off, but I could not identify exactly what was bothering me about it. I went inside to get dinner and take care of some paperwork. The restaurant was busy but not crowded, filled mostly with other truck drivers who were on similar schedules to mine. I found a table near the window where I could keep an eye on my truck while I ate, a habit I had developed after having equipment stolen from unsecured trailers earlier in my career. While I was eating, I struck up a conversation with another driver named Bill, who was hauling furniture from North Carolina to California. He was about my age and had similar experience on the road, so we naturally started comparing notes about routes, fuel prices, and recent changes in DOT regulations. It was the kind of casual conversation that happens all the time in truck stops across the country. During our conversation, Bill mentioned that he had been seeing the same blue sedan at several truck stops along his route over the past 3 days. He said it was always parked in the same suspicious manner, away from the main parking areas, but positioned where the occupants could watch the truckers coming and going. He had reported it to security at one location, but by the time they investigated, the car had disappeared. This information immediately got my attention because I was now seeing the same vehicle that Bill had been describing. We compared our routes and realized that we had been traveling along very similar paths, stopping at many of the same locations. If someone in that blue sedan was following truckers, they had been tracking both of us for several days. Bill suggested that we contact local law enforcement, but when we asked the truck stop security office to call police, they told us that, unless a specific crime had been committed, there was nothing they could do about someone parking legally in a public area. They said they would keep an eye on the situation, but their tone suggested that they thought we were being paranoid. After dinner, I went back to my truck to prepare for sleep. I had a comfortable sleeper cab with a bed, small refrigerator, and basic amenities that allowed me to live on the road for weeks at a time. I went through my normal evening routine of checking my doors and windows, reviewing my logbook, and setting my alarm for an early departure. Before settling down for the night, I took one more look around the parking lot. The blue sedan was still there, but now it had moved to a different location. It was parked behind a row of trailers, where it would be harder to see from the main building, but still positioned to observe the truck parking area. This confirmed my suspicions that whoever was in that car was deliberately watching the truckers. I decided to take some precautions. I locked all my doors, kept my cell phone fully charged and within easy reach, and placed a tire iron under my pillow where I could access it quickly if needed. I also made a note of the sedan's license plate number and sent a text message to my dispatcher with all the details, asking them to contact authorities if they did not hear from me by my scheduled check-in time the next morning. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by the sound of someone trying the door handle on my truck. I remained perfectly still and listened carefully, trying to determine how many people were outside and what they might be planning. Through the curtains of my sleeper cab, I could see at least 2 figures moving around my truck, testing doors and examining the trailer coupling. One of them was using what appeared to be a flashlight or cell phone light to inspect something near the rear of my trailer. The other person was at the driver's side of the cab, apparently trying to determine if I was inside and awake. They were being very quiet and deliberate in their movements, clearly experienced at whatever they were attempting to do. I quietly reached for my cell phone to call 911, but discovered that I had no signal. This was extremely unusual because the truck stop was located near a major highway, and cellular coverage in the area had always been excellent during my previous visits. Someone was jamming cell phone signals, which meant this was not a random theft attempt, but a coordinated attack. The people outside my truck were now having a whispered conversation, but I could not make out what they were saying. After a few minutes, they moved away from my truck and I heard a car door slam somewhere in the distance. I waited another hour before carefully looking out to see if they had left the area. The blue sedan was gone, but I noticed that several other trucks in the parking lot now had small devices attached to their trailer hitches or bumpers. These appeared to be some kind of tracking equipment, probably GPS units that would allow the criminals to follow specific vehicles after they left the truck stop. I immediately began checking my own truck for similar devices, using a flashlight to examine every possible hiding place where something could be attached. I found a small magnetic device stuck to the underside of my trailer, positioned where it would be almost impossible to spot during a normal pre-trip inspection. The device was about the size of a matchbox and appeared to be some kind of GPS tracker. It had a small antenna and what looked like a cellular modem, suggesting that it could transmit location data in real time to whoever was monitoring it. I carefully removed it and placed it in a metal container in my cab that would block any signals it might be sending. At this point, I realized that I was dealing with something much more serious than simple truck stop crime. Someone was systematically tracking long-haul truckers, probably planning to rob them at isolated locations along their routes. The fact that they were using cell phone jammers and sophisticated tracking equipment suggested that this was a well-organized criminal operation. I started my truck and immediately drove to the front of the truck stop, where I parked under the brightest lights available and used the payphone to call 911. When the police arrived about 20 minutes later, I showed them the tracking device and explained everything that had happened during the night. The officers took my report seriously and began investigating immediately. They found similar tracking devices on 8 other trucks in the parking lot and discovered that the blue sedan I had been seeing was registered to a known criminal who was wanted in connection with several truck hijackings in Texas and New Mexico. Over the next few hours, more law enforcement officers arrived, including detectives from a multi-state task force that had been investigating a series of truck-related crimes. They told me that my report had provided them with crucial evidence that confirmed their suspicions about a criminal organization that was targeting long-haul truckers throughout the Southwest. The investigation revealed that the criminals were using truck stops as surveillance points to identify valuable loads and track truckers to isolated areas where they could be robbed without witnesses. In several cases, drivers who resisted had been seriously injured or killed. The tracking devices allowed the criminals to follow their targets for hundreds of miles, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The man in the blue sedan turned out to be part of a larger network that included corrupt truck stop employees who provided inside information about valuable shipments and driver schedules. They had been operating for over 2 years and were responsible for at least 15 truck hijackings and 3 homicides. Thanks to the evidence I provided and the cooperation of other drivers who had seen suspicious activity, law enforcement was able to arrest 7 people involved in the operation. The leader of the group was eventually convicted of multiple felonies, including murder, armed robbery, and racketeering, and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach truck stop security. I now perform much more thorough inspections of my vehicle at every stop, and I am much more aware of other people in truck stop parking areas. I also carry additional communication equipment that cannot be easily jammed, and I maintain regular contact with other drivers who travel similar routes. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. The criminal organization that targeted me was sophisticated and well organized, but they made the mistake of being too persistent in their surveillance. By paying attention to patterns and details that seemed out of place, I was able to identify the threat before it became deadly. The trucking industry has implemented additional security measures since this incident, including better lighting at truck stops, improved communication systems, and increased coordination with law enforcement agencies. But the threat still exists, and drivers need to remain vigilant about the possibility of being targeted by criminals who view us as easy prey. Every time I stop at a truck stop now, especially during overnight hours, I remember that night in Texas when I came closer to becoming a victim than I ever want to experience again. The highway can be a dangerous place, not just because of traffic accidents or mechanical failures, but because there are people out there who make their living by preying on those of us who make our living on the road. I still love being a truck driver, and I still believe that the vast majority of people I encounter are honest and decent. But I will never again underestimate the importance of staying alert and being prepared for the possibility that someone might be watching, waiting for the right moment to turn a routine stop into a nightmare. My name is Braylon, and when I was 17 years old, I witnessed something at a highway rest stop that changed my entire understanding of how dangerous the world really is. This happened during the summer of 2021, when my family and I were driving from our home in Denver to visit relatives in Phoenix. What started as a routine family vacation became the catalyst for uncovering a human trafficking operation that had been preying on travelers along major interstate highways for years. I was the typical teenage skeptic who thought my parents were overprotective and paranoid about stranger danger. At 17, I felt like I was old enough to handle myself in any situation, and I often rolled my eyes when my mom would lecture me and my younger sister about staying close to the family during our stops on long road trips. I thought their warnings about talking to strangers or wandering off alone were outdated advice that did not apply to someone my age. Our family had been driving for about 6 hours when we stopped at a large rest area along Interstate 25 in New Mexico. It was one of those major facilities that serves thousands of travelers every day, with extensive parking areas, multiple restroom buildings, picnic areas, and even a small visitor center with tourist information. The place was busy but not crowded, with maybe 30 or 40 other vehicles in the parking area when we arrived. My parents and my 13-year-old sister, Emma, went to use the restrooms, while I stayed near our SUV to stretch my legs and check my phone for messages. I was leaning against the car, half paying attention to the other people moving around the rest area, when I noticed a white panel van parked at the far edge of the parking lot, away from most of the other vehicles. What caught my attention was not the van itself, but the way the people around it were behaving. There were 3 men standing near the van, and they kept looking around nervously, as if they were watching to see if anyone was paying attention to them. One of them was talking on a cell phone, while the other 2 seemed to be having an intense conversation about something. While I was watching them, I saw a young woman walking toward the restroom building. She appeared to be about college age, maybe 20 or 21, traveling alone. She had pulled up in a small sedan and was walking across the parking lot with her purse and a bottle of water. Nothing about her seemed unusual or suspicious, just another traveler taking a break during a long drive. That was when I saw one of the men from the white van start following her. He stayed about 20 feet behind her, matching her pace and direction, but trying to appear casual about it. When she went into the women's restroom, he positioned himself near the building entrance where he could see when she came out. The other 2 men had moved closer as well, and all 3 of them were now clearly focused on this young woman. I felt like something was wrong, but I was not sure what I should do about it. These were grown adults, and I was just a teenager, who might be misinterpreting a perfectly innocent situation. Maybe they were waiting for someone they knew, or maybe they were just killing time while taking their own rest break. But the way they were watching this woman made me uncomfortable. When the young woman came out of the restroom, the three men immediately started moving toward her. They spread out so that they were approaching from different directions, which seemed like a coordinated tactic rather than a coincidence. One of them called out to her, saying something I could not hear from my distance, and she stopped and turned to face him. From her body language, it was clear that she did not know this person and was not expecting to be approached by him. She took a step back and shook her head at whatever he was saying to her. The man kept talking and moving closer, while the other two men positioned themselves on either side of her, effectively blocking her path back to her car. That was when I realized I was witnessing an abduction in progress. The young woman was now clearly frightened and was looking around for help, but most of the other people in the rest area were either inside the buildings or too far away to notice what was happening. The three men were closing in on her, and one of them had grabbed her arm and was trying to pull her toward the white van. I ran toward my family, who were just coming out of the restroom building. I started yelling that someone was being kidnapped and pointing toward the white van. My dad immediately looked in the direction I was pointing and saw the three men forcing the young woman toward their vehicle. Without hesitation, he started running toward them while shouting for other people to call 911. The men saw my dad approaching and realized that their operation had been discovered. They quickly pushed the young woman into the back of the van and jumped in themselves. The van started moving immediately, speeding toward the rest area exit, while my dad chased them on foot. He was not able to catch them, but he did manage to get a partial license plate number and a good description of the vehicle. By this time, other travelers had noticed the commotion and several people were calling 911. Within 10 minutes, the rest area was swarming with state police officers and FBI agents who had been patrolling the area as part of an ongoing investigation into similar incidents. What we learned from the law enforcement officers was absolutely shocking. The FBI had been tracking a human trafficking ring that was operating along major interstate highways throughout the Southwest. The criminals were using rest areas, truck stops, and gas stations as hunting grounds, where they would identify and abduct young women who were traveling alone. The operation was sophisticated and well organized. The traffickers would position scouts at busy travel locations to identify potential victims. They looked for women who appeared to be traveling alone, were not local to the area, and seemed vulnerable or isolated. Once they selected a target, a team would move in to surround and abduct the victim, usually using force or threats to get them into a vehicle. The victims were then transported to locations where they would be held against their will and forced into prostitution or other forms of sexual exploitation. The FBI estimated that this particular trafficking ring had been responsible for abducting at least 25 women over the previous 2 years, and that most of the victims were never seen again by their families. The agents told us that my quick thinking and my family's intervention had almost certainly saved the young woman's life. If she had been successfully abducted, she would likely have disappeared forever, becoming another missing person case with no resolution. The traffickers were experts at moving their victims quickly across state lines and concealing them in locations where law enforcement could not easily find them. The white van was found abandoned about 50 miles away, but the three men and the young woman were gone. The FBI launched a massive search operation using helicopters, tracking dogs, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. They were able to track the criminals to a truck stop in Arizona, where they found the young woman locked in the back of a different vehicle. She was rescued alive, but had been severely traumatized by her ordeal. The three men were arrested and charged with federal crimes including kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy. During their interrogation, they provided information that led to the arrest of 14 other people involved in the trafficking ring, including the leaders of the organization. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the operation. The trafficking ring had been using a network of scouts positioned at travel locations throughout Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. They communicated using encrypted phones and had established safe houses where victims could be held temporarily before being moved to their final destinations. Most disturbing of all, the FB. I discovered that the criminals had been specifically targeting young women who were traveling to start new jobs or attend college in different states. They knew that these women were less likely to be missed immediately, and that their disappearances might be attributed to them changing their minds about their plans rather than being recognized as kidnapping cases. The young woman who was rescued, whose name was never released publicly for her protection, was a college student who had been driving from California to Texas to start graduate school. She had stopped at the rest area for what should have been a routine bathroom break, and within minutes found herself being forced into a van by strangers who intended to sell her into sexual slavery. During the trial, prosecutors revealed that the trafficking ring had been operating for at least 5 years and had generated millions of dollars in profits from their criminal activities. The victims were transported across international borders and sold to brothels and other criminal organizations that exploited them for years. All 3 men who were involved in the attempted abduction at the rest area were convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The leaders of the trafficking ring received similar sentences, while other members of the organization were sentenced to terms ranging from 20 to 40 years in federal prison. The experience fundamentally changed how I view the world and understand the dangers that exist in places that appear safe and normal. Rest areas and truck stops are locations that millions of Americans use every day without any problems. But they are also hunting grounds for predators who specifically target travelers who appear vulnerable or isolated. I learned that human trafficking is not something that only happens in foreign countries or in movies, but is a real and present danger that exists throughout the United States. The FBI estimates that thousands of people are trafficked within the United States every year, and that many of these victims are abducted from public places by criminals who operate with sophisticated planning and coordination. Since this incident, I have become an advocate for awareness about human trafficking and the warning signs that indicate when someone might be in danger. I speak at schools and community groups about what I witnessed that day and how important it is for people to trust their instincts when something seems wrong. The young woman who was rescued has asked to remain anonymous, but she did send my family a letter thanking us for our intervention. She wrote that she had given up hope of ever seeing her family again during the hours she was held captive, and that knowing someone had cared enough to help a stranger had restored her faith in humanity. She was eventually able to complete her graduate studies and now works as a counselor, helping other victims of human trafficking. She told us that turning her traumatic experience into a way to help others has been an important part of her healing process. The FBI agents who worked on this case told us that citizen awareness and intervention are crucial tools in the fight against human trafficking. They said that most successful rescues happen because ordinary people notice suspicious behavior and are willing to take action to help potential victims. My parents, who I had always thought were overprotective, turned out to have good instincts about the real dangers that exist in the world. The experience taught me that being aware of your surroundings and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong are not signs of paranoia, but important survival skills. I will never forget that day at the rest area, or the knowledge that a few minutes of inaction could have resulted in an innocent young woman disappearing forever. The highway rest stops and travel centers that connect our cities and states are generally safe places, but they are also locations where predators hunt for victims among the millions of travelers who use these facilities every year. Today, whenever I stop at a rest area or gas station during a road trip, I pay attention to the people around me and watch for behavior that seems suspicious or threatening. I know that most of the people I encounter are honest travelers just like me, but I also know that somewhere among them might be criminals who are looking for their next victim. The traffickers who targeted that young woman made the mistake of operating in front of witnesses who were willing to act. Because my family and I were paying attention and were willing to get involved, a dangerous criminal organization was dismantled, and dozens of potential future victims were spared from experiencing the nightmare of human trafficking. My name is Khaleesi, and what I am about to tell you happened to me in October of 2021 during what was supposed to be a therapeutic solo road trip through Nevada. At 26 years old, I had just gone through a difficult divorce and needed time alone to clear my head and figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I had always been an independent person, someone who was not afraid to travel alone or take risks, but this experience taught me that sometimes kindness can be the most dangerous thing in the world. I had been driving for 3 days, starting from my apartment in Portland and heading toward Las Vegas, where my sister lived. The plan was to spend a week with her before deciding whether to move to Nevada permanently or return to Oregon and rebuild my life there. I was taking the scenic route, avoiding major highways, and instead following smaller state roads that wound through some of the most beautiful and isolated landscape in the American West. My car was a reliable 2018 Honda Civic that had never given me any trouble. I had loaded it up with camping gear, enough supplies for a week on the road, and my grandmother's old road atlas because I preferred navigating with paper maps rather than relying entirely on GPS. There was something romantic about the old-fashioned approach to road travel, and I wanted this trip to be as disconnected from modern technology as possible. The weather had been perfect for the first 3 days of my journey. Clear skies, comfortable temperatures, and excellent visibility made driving through the desert landscape almost meditative. I had stopped at several small towns along the way, meeting friendly locals and discovering hidden gems that no guidebook had ever mentioned. By the time I crossed into Nevada, I was feeling more confident and optimistic about my future than I had in months. That changed on the 4th day when I encountered the storm. It began as a few scattered clouds on the horizon, nothing that seemed particularly threatening. But weather in the desert can change incredibly quickly, and within an hour, I found myself driving through one of the most violent thunderstorms I had ever experienced. The rain was coming down so hard that my windshield wipers could barely keep up, and the wind was strong enough to push my car around on the highway. Lightning was striking constantly, illuminating the desert landscape in brief, dramatic flashes that made everything look surreal and otherworldly. Thunder was so loud and frequent that it felt like being inside a war zone. I slowed down to about 30 miles per hour and turned on my hazard lights, desperately looking for somewhere safe to pull over and wait out the storm. The highway I was traveling on was a 2-lane road that cut through the most remote part of northern Nevada. There were no buildings, no rest stops, no safe places to take shelter. The ditches on either side of the road were already flooding, and I was afraid that if I pulled over, I might get stuck in the soft desert sand that was rapidly turning to mud. That was when I saw the hitchhiker. He was standing on the side of the road about a quarter mile ahead of me, completely soaked from the rain and waving frantically for me to stop. My first instinct was to keep driving. I had been warned countless times about the dangers of picking up strangers, especially as a woman traveling alone. But something about the situation felt different. The storm was so severe that leaving someone stranded in it could literally be a death sentence. As I got closer, I could see that the hitchhiker appeared to be a man in his 30s, wearing what looked like hiking clothes and carrying a large backpack. He seemed genuinely distressed, not threatening or dangerous. When I pulled over and rolled down my passenger window, he ran to the car and leaned down to speak with me. His voice was strangely calm despite the circumstances. He thanked me profusely for stopping and explained that his car had broken down about 5 miles back and that he had been walking in the storm for over an hour trying to find help. He said his name was David and that he was a photographer who had been documenting abandoned buildings in the Nevada desert when the storm hit. Everything about his story seemed legitimate. He was polite, well-spoken, and appeared genuinely grateful for my help. He asked if I could give him a ride to the next town, which according to my map was about 40 miles ahead. I hesitated for a moment, but the storm was getting worse, and I could not bring myself to leave someone stranded in such dangerous conditions. I unlocked the passenger door, and David climbed into my car, placing his wet backpack on the floor and immediately apologizing for dripping water all over my seats. He seemed relieved to be out of the storm, and we began driving toward the next town while making small talk about the weather and our respective travel plans. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed completely normal. David was an interesting conversationalist who told me about some of the abandoned mines and ghost towns he had been photographing. He showed me pictures on his camera, and they were genuinely impressive. Professional quality images that captured the haunting beauty of decay and abandonment in the desert landscape. But gradually, I started noticing things that did not make sense. The first thing I noticed was that David never seemed to blink. I kept glancing over at him while driving, and his eyes remained fixed and unblinking in a way that was subtly disturbing. When I mentioned this to myself internally, I tried to catch him blinking by looking directly at him, but his stare remained constant and unnatural. The second thing I noticed was his reflection, or rather the lack of it. Every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I could see my own reflection clearly, but David cast no reflection whatsoever. The passenger seat appeared empty in the mirror, even though I could clearly see him sitting right next to me when I looked directly at him. The third thing was his breathing. Despite having been walking in a cold rainstorm for over an hour, David showed no signs of being out of breath or trying to warm up. His clothes were soaking wet, but he never shivered or complained about being cold. In fact, I realized that I could not hear him breathing at all, even in the confined space of my car. By this point, my heart was racing and I was starting to panic, but I tried to remain calm and act normal. I did not want to provoke whatever was sitting next to me by letting it know that I had figured out something was wrong. I kept driving toward town, hoping that I could get to safety before the situation escalated. That was when David started talking about me. He began describing details about my life that I had never mentioned to him. He knew about my recent divorce, the specific reasons why my marriage had ended, and even intimate details about my relationship with my ex-husband that I had never told anyone. He knew where I worked, where I lived, and what I had been doing for the past several months. But worse than that, he started describing my thoughts. He began repeating internal conversations I had been having with myself during the drive, private thoughts and concerns that no one else could possibly have known. He described my doubts about moving to Nevada, my fears about starting over, and my anxiety about traveling alone. When I asked him how he could possibly know these things, David smiled for the first time since getting in my car. It was not a human smile. His mouth stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous to fit in a normal human mouth. His eyes, which had been dark brown when he first got in the car, were now completely black with no visible pupils or irises. That was when I realized that I was trapped in my car with something that was definitely not human. David began speaking in my own voice, perfectly mimicking my accent and speech patterns while repeating conversations I had had with friends and family over the past few weeks. The sound of my own voice coming from his mouth was absolutely terrifying, especially when he started saying things that I had never actually said, twisted versions of my thoughts and feelings that revealed intimate knowledge of my psyche. I tried to pull over and force him out of the car, but when I reached for the door handle, David grabbed my wrist with a grip that was impossibly strong. His fingers felt like ice, and I could feel them pressing against my bones with enough force to leave bruises. He calmly told me to keep driving, using my own voice to give the command. For the next 15 miles, David continued his psychological torture. He described in detail how he was going to take my place, assuming my identity and living my life. He explained that he had been watching me for weeks, learning everything about me, preparing for this moment when he could complete the transformation. The most terrifying part was when he started describing what he was going to do to my sister when he reached Las Vegas. Using my voice and mannerisms, he planned to convince her that he was really me, and then slowly destroy her life from the inside. He described intimate details about my sister's life that he should not have known, proving that his stalking had extended far beyond just me. As we approached the lights of the next town, I made a desperate decision. Instead of driving to the town center where David expected me to go, I suddenly swerved off the highway and drove straight toward a concrete barrier that separated the road from a deep irrigation ditch. The impact was tremendous. My car hit the barrier at about 50 miles per hour, and I was thrown forward against my seatbelt hard enough to crack several ribs. The airbags deployed, filling the car with smoke and powder. For several minutes, I was unconscious. When I came to, David was gone. The passenger door was hanging open, and there was no sign of him anywhere. His backpack was still on the floor of my car, but when I opened it to look for identification, I found that it contained nothing but rocks and dead vegetation, as if someone had just filled it with random debris to make it look legitimate. The local police found me about an hour later. They were initially suspicious of my story, especially when I could not provide any identification for the hitchhiker I claimed to have picked up. But when they searched the area where I said his car had broken down, they found an abandoned vehicle that had been sitting there for over 3 years. The investigating officer told me that I was not the first person to report picking up a hitchhiker on that particular stretch of highway, and that several other drivers had described similar experiences. He advised me to never pick up hitchhikers in that area again, and to report any similar encounters immediately. I never made it to Las Vegas. Instead, I had my car towed back to the nearest town and flew home to Oregon the next day. The experience left me with a profound fear of traveling alone, and I have never again picked up a hitchhiker under any circumstances. To this day, I do not know what David actually was or what would have happened if I had not crashed my car. But I know that something inhuman had been stalking me for weeks, learning everything about my life, preparing to take my place. And I know that somewhere in the Nevada desert, it is still waiting for the next lonely traveler to show it kindness. My name is Jason, and I need to tell you about the worst 3 hours of my life, which happened in March of 2019 when my younger brother Jason and I were driving across the country to start new jobs in California. At 31 years old, I had finally landed my dream position as a software engineer at a tech company in San Jose, while Jason, who is 28, had been offered a management role at the same company's logistics division. We were both excited about this fresh start and had decided to make the move together, driving across the country in a rented moving truck filled with everything we owned. Jason and I had always been close, despite our different personalities. I was the cautious, analytical one who planned everything in advance, while he was more spontaneous and trusting of people. We balanced each other out well, and this cross-country move felt like the perfect opportunity for us to start a new chapter of our lives in a place where we could both pursue our career goals. The moving truck we had rented was a 26-foot budget truck, large enough to hold both of our apartment's worth of furniture and belongings. We had loaded it carefully over 2 days, making sure everything was secured properly for the long drive ahead. The plan was to drive from our hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, to San Jose in 4 days, taking turns behind the wheel and staying in motels along the way. The first 3 days of our trip went perfectly. We made excellent time driving through Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, and into Colorado. The weather was beautiful, the truck was running well, and we were both in great spirits about our upcoming new jobs. We spent hours talking about our plans for California, the apartments we wanted to find, and how different our lives were going to be on the West Coast. On the 4th morning, we left Denver early and began the final push toward California. We were planning to drive straight through to San Jose, a distance of about 1,200 miles that would take us approximately 18 hours with breaks for fuel and food. It was an ambitious plan, but we were both eager to reach our destination and start our new lives. The problems began when we stopped for lunch at a rest area outside of Grand Junction, Colorado. The rest area was one of those standard highway facilities with picnic tables, restrooms, and vending machines. It was not particularly busy, with maybe a dozen other vehicles in the parking area when we arrived around noon. The location seemed safe and well maintained, exactly the kind of place where travelers regularly stopped without any concerns about security. We parked the moving truck in a spot that would give us plenty of room to maneuver when we were ready to leave, and walked over to one of the picnic tables to eat the sandwiches we had packed for lunch. The day was warm and sunny, and it felt good to get out of the truck and stretch our legs after driving for several hours. While we were eating, a man approached our table and asked if we needed any help with directions or recommendations for places to stop along our route. He appeared to be in his 40s, casually dressed, and seemed genuinely friendly. He introduced himself as Mike and said he was a local who often helped travelers who were passing through the area. Mike asked where we were headed, and when we told him we were moving to California, he became very interested in our story. He asked about our jobs, where we were planning to live, and how long we'd been planning the move. His questions seemed like normal small talk, but looking back, I realized he was gathering information about us and our situation. After talking for about 10 minutes, Mike excused himself and walked back toward the parking area. Jason and I finished our lunch and were getting ready to continue driving when we noticed that Mike was talking to two other men near a pickup truck that had not been there when we arrived. The three of them kept glancing in our direction while they talked, which made me uncomfortable. I suggested to Jason that we should leave immediately, but he thought I was being paranoid. He pointed out that we had not seen or heard anything actually threatening, and that the men might just be curious about our moving truck or planning their own travel routes. Jason has always been more trusting than me, and he convinced me that I was overreacting to what was probably just a normal interaction between travelers. We walked back to our truck, and I started the engine while Jason secured some items that had shifted during the morning drive. That was when the three men approached us. Mike came to the driver's side window while the other two men positioned themselves on either side of the truck. Mike's demeanor had completely changed from the friendly traveler we had met earlier. His voice was now cold and commanding, and he was holding something in his right hand that I could not quite see clearly. He told me to turn off the engine and get out of the truck. When I asked why, he showed me that he was holding a knife with about a 4-inch blade. He said that he and his friends needed our truck and everything in it, and that if we cooperated, nobody would get hurt. He made it clear that if we resisted or tried to call for help, the situation would become much more dangerous for both of us. I looked over at Jason, who had gone pale but was trying to remain calm. The other two men were now clearly visible, and I could see that at least one of them was also armed. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and in the middle of nowhere with no immediate help available. The rest area had cleared out while we were eating lunch, and there were no other people around to witness what was happening. Mike ordered me to get out of the truck and throw him the keys. I complied, hoping that they would just take the truck and leave us alone, but instead of simply driving away with our belongings, they forced both Jason and me to walk toward their pickup truck. It became clear that they were not just planning to steal our moving truck, but were planning to take us somewhere else as well. That was when I realized that this was not just a robbery, but a kidnapping. The men forced us into the back seat of their pickup truck, with one of them sitting between us to prevent any attempt to escape or fight back. Mike got behind the wheel and started driving away from the rest area, heading in the opposite direction from the main highway. We were being taken to a secondary location, which I knew from crime shows and news stories was usually when bad situations became deadly. During the drive, the men discussed what they were planning to do with us. They talked about holding us for ransom, selling our identities and personal information, and worst of all, eliminating us entirely so we could not identify them to police. They seemed to be experienced criminals who had done this kind of thing before, and they discussed various options with a casual attitude that was absolutely terrifying. After about 20 minutes of driving on back roads, we arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned farm or ranch. There were several run-down buildings, including a barn and a house that looked like it had been empty for years. This was clearly a place where the criminals could operate without being seen or heard by anyone else. They forced us out of the pickup truck and marched us toward the barn. Inside, I could see that this was some kind of base of operations for their criminal activities. There were tools, rope, duct tape, and other supplies that suggested they had been planning and executing kidnappings for some time. There were also personal items like wallets, jewelry, and cell phones that had obviously been taken from other victims. The realization that we were not their first victims was absolutely horrifying. These men were experienced predators who had probably kidnapped and possibly killed other people in this same location. Jason and I were just their latest targets, chosen because we appeared to be wealthy enough to be worth robbing and isolated enough to be taken without witnesses. They tied our hands behind our backs and forced us to sit on the ground while they discussed their next steps. Mike seemed to be the leader of the group, and he was arguing with the other two men about whether to demand ransom from our families or to simply take everything we had and dispose of us immediately. The casual way they discussed ending our lives was more terrifying than any movie or TV show I had ever seen. While they were arguing, I was desperately trying to think of a way to escape or signal for help. The barn had several windows, but they were too high to reach and probably too dirty for anyone outside to see through. The doors were heavy and would make noise if we tried to open them. Our phones had been taken away, so we had no way to call for help even if we could get free from the ropes. Then I remembered that I had activated a GPS tracking service on the moving truck as part of the rental agreement. The service was designed to help the rental company locate their vehicles if they were stolen, but it also meant that our families would be able to track our location if we failed to check in as planned. If these criminals kept the truck in the same area where they were holding us, there was a chance that law enforcement could find us. I decided to try to buy time by convincing the criminals that we were worth more alive than dead. I told Mike that our families had money and would pay a substantial ransom for our safe return. I also told him that our new employer was expecting us to report for work the next day, and that if we did not show up, they would immediately contact authorities and begin looking for us. This information seemed to interest Mike, and he began asking more detailed questions about our financial situations and our family's ability to pay ransom. I provided him with partially true information that made us seem valuable enough to keep alive, while avoiding giving him enough details to actually contact our families or cause them additional harm. While Mike was focused on me, Jason was working on loosening the ropes around his wrists. The criminals had tied us up quickly and had not checked their work very carefully. After about an hour of careful manipulation, Jason managed to free his hands without attracting attention from our captors. When Mike and the other two men left the barn to discuss their plans privately, Jason quickly untied me and we began looking for a way to escape. The barn had a back door that was partially hidden behind some old equipment, and we were able to open it quietly and slip outside without being seen. We found ourselves in a wooded area behind the barn with no clear path back to the main road, but we could hear traffic in the distance, which meant that civilization was not too far away. We began moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the woods, trying to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and the criminals before they realized we had escaped. After about 30 minutes of hiking through dense forest, we reached a paved road where we were able to flag down a passing motorist who called 911 for us. The police arrived within minutes and immediately began organizing a search for the criminals and our stolen moving truck. Law enforcement was able to track the GPS signal from our moving truck to the abandoned farm where we had been held. They found our truck and arrested all three criminals, who were still at the location planning their next move. It turned out that Mike and his associates were wanted in connection with several other kidnappings and robberies in Colorado and surrounding states. The investigation revealed that the criminals had been operating their kidnapping scheme for over 2 years, targeting travelers who appeared to have valuable belongings or financial resources. They had been using the abandoned farm as their base of operations, and police found evidence connecting them to at least 8 other cases involving missing persons and stolen vehicles. We were incredibly fortunate to escape when we did. During the trial, prosecutors revealed that the criminals had been planning to kill us that same evening, regardless of whether our families paid any ransom demand. They had murdered at least 3 other victims in similar circumstances, and our case was just the latest in a series of crimes that might have continued indefinitely if we had not escaped and led police to their location. The experience fundamentally changed both Jason and me. We both developed anxiety about traveling, especially in remote areas, and we became much more cautious about interacting with strangers. The trust and optimism that had characterized our relationship with the world was replaced by a constant awareness of potential threats and dangers. We did eventually make it to California and started our new jobs, but the shadow of that experience followed us for years. We both sought therapy to deal with the trauma, and it took a long time before we felt comfortable traveling together again. The moving truck and all our belongings were recovered, but many of our personal items had been damaged or contaminated by the criminals' activities. The 3 men who kidnapped us were eventually convicted of multiple felonies, including kidnapping, armed robbery, and murder. Mike received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while his 2 accomplices received sentences of 25 to 40 years in prison. The trials were difficult for us to endure, but we knew that our testimony was crucial to ensuring that these dangerous criminals could never hurt anyone else. Today, Jason and I both work in California and have built successful careers and lives on the West Coast. But we will never forget those 3 hours when we came closer to death than we ever want to experience again. The experience taught us that evil can appear anywhere, even in places that seem safe and normal, and that the line between a routine stop and a life-threatening situation can be crossed in an instant. We now carry emergency communication devices whenever we travel, and we have developed detailed safety protocols for any trips that take us through remote areas. Most importantly, we have learned to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even if we cannot immediately identify what the threat might be. The criminals who targeted us were experts at identifying and exploiting vulnerable travelers, but they made the mistake of underestimating our determination to survive and our ability to work together under pressure. Our escape probably saved not only our own lives, but the lives of future victims who would have been targeted by these predators if they had remained free. My name is Jakai, and at 29 years old, I was working as a traveling nurse, which meant I spent most of my time driving between different hospitals and medical facilities across 3 states. It was a rewarding but demanding career that required me to be on the road constantly, often driving alone through remote areas at all hours of the day and night. I loved the flexibility and variety that came with travel nursing, but in the spring of 2022, I encountered something that made me question whether the job was worth the risks I was taking. I had been working as a traveling nurse for about 4 years, specializing in emergency medicine and intensive care. My assignments typically lasted between 8 and 13 weeks, and I would drive my own car between locations rather than flying, since I needed reliable transportation once I arrived at each new hospital. This meant I was very familiar with the highway systems throughout the Midwest and had developed efficient routes between the major cities where I most often worked. My car was a 2020 Honda Accord that I had specifically chosen for its reliability and fuel efficiency. I had installed additional safety features, including a dash cam, GPS tracking, and an emergency communication system that could contact authorities if I was involved in an accident or found myself in danger. As a woman traveling alone, I took security very seriously and had developed detailed protocols for staying safe during long-distance drives. The stalking began so subtly that I did not initially realize what was happening. I first noticed the silver Chevrolet Malibu during a drive from Chicago to Indianapolis in early April. It was just another car on the highway. Nothing particularly distinctive about it except that it seemed to maintain the same distance behind me for an unusually long time. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I adjusted my speed, it adjusted its speed accordingly. At first, I assumed it was just coincidence. Highway driving often creates situations where vehicles end up traveling together for extended periods, especially when traffic conditions and speed limits create natural groupings. But after about 2 hours of this pattern, I began to feel uncomfortable about the situation. I decided to test whether the car was actually following me by taking an exit for a rest stop that I had not originally planned to use. The silver Malibu followed me off the highway and into the rest area parking lot. When I parked and went inside to use the restroom and buy a drink, I noticed through the window that the Malibu had parked several spaces away, but the driver remained in the vehicle and appeared to be watching the building entrance. When I came back outside, I pretended to check my phone while secretly observing the other car. I could see that the driver was a man, probably in his 40s or 50s, but I could not make out his features clearly due to the distance and the tinted windows of his vehicle. He seemed to be waiting for me to leave, which confirmed my suspicions that this was not a coincidence. I got back in my car and continued toward Indianapolis, and sure enough, the silver Malibu followed me back onto the highway and resumed its position several car lengths behind me. This continued for the remainder of my drive, and the car only disappeared when I exited the highway near the hospital where I was scheduled to start my new assignment. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing the same silver Malibu during several other trips between assignments. It would appear at different points along my route, sometimes following me for just a few miles, sometimes for several hours. The pattern was inconsistent enough that I initially thought it might be different cars that just happened to look similar. But gradually I began to recognize specific details like a damaged bumper and a particular arrangement of items on the dashboard. By early May, I was certain that someone was deliberately following me during my travels. The silver Malibu had appeared during at least 6 different trips, and the driver's behavior was becoming more aggressive. Instead of maintaining a respectful distance, he would drive much closer to my car, sometimes tailgating me for miles at a time. He would flash his headlights, honk his horn, and make gestures that I could see in my rearview mirror. I started documenting every encounter with photographs and detailed notes about dates, times, locations, and the car's license plate number. I also began altering my travel routes and schedules to see if I could avoid the stalker, but he seemed to know my patterns well enough to anticipate where I would be driving and when. The situation escalated significantly during a trip from St. Louis to Milwaukee in mid-May. The silver Malibu appeared shortly after I left St. Louis and followed me for the entire 4-hour drive. But this time, instead of just following, the driver began trying to force me to pull over. He would speed up and get alongside my car, gesturing for me to roll down my window or exit the highway. When I refused to acknowledge him, he would drop back and then repeat the process. At one point, he pulled directly in front of me and began slowing down, apparently trying to force me to stop. I was able to change lanes and pass him, but the experience was absolutely terrifying. I was driving 70 miles per hour on a busy interstate highway, and this person was creating dangerous situations that could have resulted in serious accidents involving multiple vehicles. I called 911 from my hands-free phone system and reported what was happening. The dispatcher took my information and said they would alert highway patrol units in the area, but by the time I reached Milwaukee, no police officers had appeared, and the silver Malibu had disappeared again. That evening, I filed a formal police report with the Milwaukee Police Department. The officers I spoke with were sympathetic, but explained that stalking cases involving multiple jurisdictions were complex to investigate and prosecute. They advised me to continue documenting every encounter and to consider changing my travel patterns or even my career if the stalking continued. The advice to change careers was particularly frustrating because I loved my work as a traveling nurse and had spent years building expertise and professional relationships that would be difficult to replace. The idea that some unknown stalker could force me to abandon my chosen profession was infuriating, but I was also becoming genuinely frightened about what might happen if the situation continued to escalate. 2 weeks later, I discovered that the stalking had extended beyond just following my car on highways. I was staying at an extended stay hotel in Detroit while working at a hospital there, and I noticed the same silver Malibu parked in the hotel parking lot. The car was positioned where the driver could observe my room and monitor my comings and goings. When I reported this to hotel security, they reviewed their parking lot surveillance footage and confirmed that the vehicle had been there for 3 days, even though the driver was not registered as a guest at the hotel. Security contacted local police, but by the time officers arrived, the car was gone. That same night, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. The message was brief, but deeply disturbing. It contained personal information about me that the stalker should not have known, including details about my work schedule, the hospitals where I had recent assignments, and even information about my family members who lived in other states. The note made it clear that the stalking was not random, but rather a targeted campaign by someone who had been researching my life and activities extensively. The writer claimed that we were meant to be together and that he had been watching over me for months. He described specific details about my daily routines and expressed anger that I had been ignoring his attempts to communicate with me on the highway. Most disturbing of all, the note contained threats about what would happen if I continued to refuse his attention. He wrote that he knew where I lived, where I worked, and where my family lived, and that he would not allow me to run away from what he described as our relationship. I immediately contacted the FBI, since the stalking was clearly occurring across state lines and involved interstate travel. The federal agents I spoke with were much more knowledgeable about stalking cases than the local police had been, and they began a formal investigation immediately. The FBI was able to identify the stalker within 2 weeks of beginning their investigation. He was a 47-year-old man named Robert who worked as a long-haul truck driver, which explained how he was able to appear in multiple states and follow my travel patterns so effectively. He had been using his knowledge of highway systems and truck stop locations to track my movements and plan his surveillance. The investigation revealed that Robert had been stalking me for over 8 months, far longer than I had realized. He had been following me during my very first assignment as a traveling nurse and had gradually escalated his behavior over time. He had collected extensive information about my personal life, work history, and family, and had been planning what he described in his journal as an inevitable confrontation, where he would force me to acknowledge his feelings. Most chilling of all, investigators found evidence that I was not his first victim. Robert had stalked at least 3 other women over the previous 5 years, using similar tactics of following them on highways and gathering personal information about their lives. One of his previous victims had been forced to leave her job and relocate to another state after he broke into her apartment and left threatening messages. Robert was arrested at a truck stop in Ohio while waiting to follow me on what would have been my next assignment. At the time of his arrest, he was carrying rope, duct tape, and other items that suggested he was planning to kidnap me rather than simply continue the stalking behavior. He was charged with multiple federal crimes, including interstate stalking, making terroristic threats, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the note he had left on my car, surveillance footage from multiple locations, and detailed journals, where he had documented his obsession with me and his plans for escalating the stalking. During the trial, prosecutors revealed that Robert had been planning to force me off the road during one of my trips and take me to a remote location where he could hold me prisoner indefinitely. He had researched isolated areas along my regular travel routes and had prepared a location where he intended to keep me captive. Robert was ultimately convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The judge specifically noted the interstate nature of his crimes and the fact that his behavior had escalated to planning a kidnapping, which demonstrated that he posed a serious ongoing threat to public safety. The experience completely changed my approach to travel nursing. I now work exclusively with agencies that provide company vehicles with professional security features, and I never travel alone on assignments that require long-distance driving. I also carry multiple communication devices and check in with family members at regular intervals during any trip. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. The early signs of Robert's stalking were subtle and could easily have been dismissed as coincidence or paranoia, but by paying attention to patterns and documenting suspicious behavior, I was able to provide law enforcement with the evidence they needed to identify and arrest a dangerous predator. The FBI agent who handled my case told me that Robert's arrest prevented what would almost certainly have been a violent crime. His journals contained detailed plans for kidnapping me, and his previous behavior with other victims showed a clear pattern of escalation that typically ends in physical violence. I still work as a traveling nurse, but I will never again underestimate the dangers that come with being a woman who travels alone for work. The highways that connect our cities and towns are also hunting grounds for predators who specifically target vulnerable travelers, and staying safe requires constant vigilance and preparation. Robert will be eligible for parole in 12 years, but I have been assured that his release will be carefully monitored and that I will be notified well in advance if he is ever freed from prison. Until then, I try to focus on my work and my life, knowing that one dangerous predator has been taken off the roads where he can no longer threaten other women who are just trying to make a living. My name is Royalty, and in the summer of 2020, when I was 19 years old, my family and I took what was supposed to be a fun road trip through the American Southwest. We had planned this vacation for months as a way to bond and explore parts of the country none of us had ever seen before. My parents, my younger brother Marcus, who was 16, and my little sister Aria, who was 12, all piled into our family SUV for what we thought would be 2 weeks of adventure and beautiful scenery. The trip started perfectly. We drove from our home in Colorado through Utah, marveling at the incredible red rock formations and national parks. Everyone was getting along great, taking hundreds of photos and genuinely enjoying each other's company. My dad had mapped out our entire route, carefully planning where we would stop each night and what attractions we wanted to visit along the way. By the fourth day of our trip, we were driving through a particularly remote section of Arizona, heading toward a resort town where we had reservations at a nice hotel. The landscape was absolutely stunning, but incredibly isolated. We had not seen another car for over 2 hours, and our cell phone signals had disappeared long ago. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by massive red sandstone formations that looked like ancient monuments. That was when our SUV started having problems. It began with a strange rattling sound coming from under the hood, followed by a gradual loss of power. My dad, who knew quite a bit about cars, immediately recognized that something serious was wrong. We managed to pull over to the side of the highway, but when Dad popped the hood, he discovered that our serpentine belt had snapped, and several other components had been damaged as well. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone service and no way to call for help. The sun was already beginning to set, and temperatures in the desert dropped dramatically after dark. Dad tried flagging down passing vehicles, but In over an hour of waiting, not a single car came by in either direction. Just as we were starting to panic about spending the night in our disabled vehicle, we saw lights in the distance. About 2 miles ahead, there appeared to be some kind of building with neon signs advertising a motel and restaurant. It looked like a mirage at first, but as we gathered our overnight bags and started walking toward it, the building became more and more real. The place was called the Desert Rose Motel, and it looked like it had been built sometime in the 1960s and never updated. The architecture was classic roadside Americana, with a long row of rooms facing a central parking lot and a separate building that housed the office and restaurant. Neon signs advertised vacancy, air conditioning, and home-cooked meals, though several of the letters were burned out or flickering. The parking lot contained about 6 other vehicles, which surprised us given how remote the location was. There was an old pickup truck, a couple of sedans from the 1990s, a motorcycle, and what looked like a small RV. It was reassuring to know that we were not the only travelers who had discovered this place. The motel office was small and cramped, decorated with faded photographs of local landmarks and tourism brochures that looked like they were decades old. Behind the counter stood a woman who appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair and a friendly smile. She introduced herself as Martha and said she had been running the Desert Rose for over 20 years. Martha was extremely sympathetic about our car trouble and assured us that a mechanic would be by in the morning to take a look at our SUV. She said this kind of thing happened frequently on this stretch of highway, and that she always kept a few rooms available for stranded motorists. The rates were very reasonable, and she even offered to let us eat dinner in the restaurant at no charge since we were dealing with unexpected car problems. We checked into 2 adjoining rooms, one for my parents and one for my siblings and me. The rooms were clean but definitely dated, with furniture and decor that looked like it had not been changed since the motel was built. The beds were comfortable enough, and the air conditioning worked well, which was the most important thing given the desert heat. Dinner in the restaurant was surprisingly good. The menu was simple, but the food was fresh and well prepared. There were a few other guests eating as well, including an elderly couple who said they had been staying at the motel for several days, and a middle-aged man traveling alone who claimed to be a traveling salesman. Everyone seemed friendly and normal, just regular people who had found themselves at this remote desert motel for various reasons. After dinner, we went back to our rooms and tried to get some rest. The plan was to get up early and hopefully get our car fixed so we could continue our vacation. Despite the unexpected complication, everyone was in good spirits and treating the whole thing as an adventure rather than a disaster. That was when I started noticing that something was wrong with my family. It began with small things that could easily be explained away. My little sister, Aria, who was normally very talkative and energetic, became quiet and withdrawn. When I asked her what was wrong, she just stared at me with a blank expression and said everything was fine, but her voice sounded flat and emotionless in a way that was completely unlike her. My brother Marcus started acting strange too. He kept staring out the window at the desert, even though there was nothing to see in the darkness. When I asked him what he was looking at, he turned to me with the same blank expression that Aria had shown and said he was just enjoying the view. But his eyes looked different somehow, as if something behind them had changed. Even my parents seemed off. They were speaking to each other in whispers, having conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I came near them. When I tried to join their discussions, they would change the subject or act like they had not been talking about anything important. This was completely unlike their normal behavior, especially on family vacations, when they usually included my siblings and me in all their planning. By the second day, the changes in my family's behavior had become impossible to ignore. They moved differently, spoke differently, and seemed to have lost interest in things that had always been important to them. Aria stopped asking about when we could continue our trip. Marcus stopped complaining about being bored. My parents stopped discussing our itinerary or checking on our car repair progress. When I tried to bring up these concerns, they all insisted that everything was normal and that I was being paranoid. But their responses felt rehearsed, as if they were reciting lines from a script rather than having genuine conversations with me. The way they looked at me had changed too. Instead of the warm, familiar expressions I'd known my entire life, their eyes held a cold, calculating quality that made me deeply uncomfortable. The other guests at the motel were acting strangely as well. The elderly couple I had met on our first night were still there, even though they had mentioned they were just passing through. The traveling salesman was also still there, and when I asked him about his business, he gave vague, contradictory answers that made no sense. But the most disturbing thing was Martha, the motel owner. She seemed to be keeping close tabs on all the guests, appearing whenever I tried to explore the property or ask questions about our car repair. She always had a ready explanation for any concerns I raised, but her answers felt evasive and her smile never quite reached her eyes. On the third morning, I made a discovery that confirmed my worst fears. While my family was having breakfast in the restaurant, I snuck out to check on our SUV, which was supposedly being repaired in the motel's garage. When I looked under the hood, I could see that nothing had been done to fix the problems. In fact, it looked like additional damage had been inflicted on the engine, as if someone was deliberately ensuring that we could not leave. That was when I realized that we were not guests at this motel. We were prisoners. I started paying closer attention to the other people at the Desert Rose, and I began to notice details that terrified me. None of them cast proper shadows in the bright desert sunlight. Their reflections in windows and mirrors were distorted or sometimes missing entirely. And occasionally, when they thought no one was looking, their human facades would slip slightly, revealing glimpses of something else underneath. The thing that looked like my little sister would sometimes forget to blink for minutes at a time. The thing that looked like my brother would move with an unnatural fluidity that no human body could achieve. The things that looked like my parents would have conversations using words and phrases that were not part of their normal vocabulary. I realized that whatever had happened to my real family, these creatures had taken their place. They had studied my family closely enough to mimic their appearances and basic mannerisms, but they could not perfectly replicate the subtle details that make each person unique. They were wearing my family like masks and doing an increasingly poor job of maintaining the illusion. The question was, what had happened to the real Marcus area and my parents? And how long did I have before whatever had taken them decided to replace me as well? I started planning my escape, but it had to be done carefully. The creatures that had replaced my family were watching me constantly, and Martha seemed to have an uncanny ability to appear whenever I tried to do anything suspicious. I needed to find a way to get away from the motel and find help, but I also needed to figure out if there was any way to save my real family. On the fourth night, I pretended to go to sleep early but actually stayed awake, listening carefully to what was happening in the next room. Through the thin walls, I could hear the creatures that looked like my parents having a conversation, but they were not speaking English. The sounds they made were guttural and animalistic, like nothing any human throat could produce. Around midnight, I heard them leave their room. Through my window, I watched as all the guests at the motel, including the things that looked like my family, gathered in the parking lot. They stood in a circle around something in the center that I could not quite see and began making those same inhuman sounds in what appeared to be some kind of ritual or ceremony. That was when I saw them begin to change. Their human appearances melted away like wax, revealing the true forms underneath. They were tall, gaunt creatures with elongated limbs and faces that were a horrifying mixture of human and animal features. Their skin was a mottled gray color, and their eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light in the darkness. In the center of their circle, I could see what looked like a pit or hole in the ground. As I watched in horror, they began dragging something out of the pit. It was a human body, but it was too dark and too far away for me to identify who it was. They carried the body toward the motel building, and I realized with growing terror that they were bringing it to one of the rooms. I knew that I had to escape immediately before they completed whatever ritual they were performing. I quietly gathered my belongings and slipped out the back window of my room, avoiding the parking lot where the creatures were still gathered. Using the desert landscape as cover, I began making my way toward the highway, hoping to flag down a passing vehicle or at least get far enough away to use my cell phone. The desert at night was terrifyingly vast and disorienting. Without the motel's lights as a reference point, I quickly became lost among the rock formations and sandy washes. I walked for hours, following what I hoped was the direction of the highway, but I never found the road or encountered any other signs of civilization. Just as the sun was beginning to rise, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 2 police cars appeared, followed by an ambulance and what looked like a federal government vehicle. They found me dehydrated and exhausted, barely conscious after wandering in the desert all night. The officers told me that they had been looking for my family and me after we failed to check in at our hotel reservation. When they traced our route and found our abandoned SUV, they had conducted a search of the area and discovered the Desert Rose Motel. But when they arrived at the motel, they found it completely abandoned. There were no guests, no staff, and no sign that anyone had been there recently. More disturbing still, when they checked the registration records and business licenses, they discovered that the Desert Rose Motel had been permanently closed for over 15 years. The building was condemned and scheduled for demolition, though that process had been delayed by legal disputes over the property ownership. My real family was never found. Despite extensive searches of the area and investigations by multiple law enforcement agencies, no trace of Marcus, Aria, or my parents was ever discovered. The official conclusion was that they had somehow gotten lost in the desert and died of exposure, but their bodies were never recovered. I know the truth, though. Somewhere in that vast desert, there is a place that exists outside normal reality, where creatures take the forms of human beings and prey on travelers who are unlucky enough to become stranded. My family is still there, trapped in whatever dimension or realm the Desert Rose Motel actually occupies. And sometimes, late at night, I still get phone calls from numbers I do not recognize. When I answer, I hear voices that sound exactly like my parents and siblings, asking me when I'm coming home, telling me how much they miss me, begging me to come back to the desert and find them. But I know that whatever is making those calls is not my real family. It is something else, something that wants to complete the collection by adding me to their number. I will never return to that part of the country, and I will never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when those creatures decide to come looking for me. My name is Princeton, and this story takes place 3 years after the terrifying experience I had with my friends Jackson and Camden in the desert. I was 25 years old and working as an accountant for a small firm in Columbus, Ohio. The supernatural encounter we had with the thing that stalked our RV had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand, but I thought I had put those experiences behind me. I was wrong. It was a cold November evening in 2022, and I was driving home from a client meeting that had run much later than expected. I had been working on tax preparation for a manufacturing company about 2 hours north of Columbus, and by the time we finished going through their books, it was already past 9 o'clock at night. The drive home normally took me about 2 hours on familiar highways, but I was exhausted and not looking forward to the long trip through rural Ohio in the darkness. My car was a reliable 2019 Toyota Camry that had never given me any problems. I had driven this route dozens of times over the past year as part of my regular client visits, so I knew every exit, every curve, and every landmark along the way. The highways were well maintained and usually had decent traffic even late at night, so I felt comfortable making the drive despite my fatigue. About 30 minutes into my drive home, I decided to take a shortcut that would save me about 20 minutes and avoid some construction that had been slowing traffic on the main highway. I had seen signs for this alternate route during previous trips, but had never actually used it. According to my GPS, it was a state highway that would connect back to the main interstate about 15 miles south of my usual route. I turned off at the designated exit and found myself on a 2-lane road that cut through heavily forested areas. The road was in good condition and had clear lane markings, but it was much more isolated than I had expected. I had not seen another vehicle since leaving the main highway, and there were no houses, businesses, or streetlights anywhere along the route. After driving for about 45 minutes on this alternate highway, I began to realize that something was wrong. According to my GPS, I should have reached the connection point with the main interstate by now, but there were no signs indicating that I was approaching any major highway. In fact, I had not seen any road signs at all for the past 20 miles, which was unusual for any public highway in Ohio. I tried to recalculate my route using the GPS, but the system kept showing that I was on the correct road and that my destination was still ahead of me. However, the estimated arrival time kept increasing rather than decreasing as I drove. The GPS showed that I had been traveling for over an hour, but according to the system, I was still more than an hour away from home. That was when I started noticing the other vehicles. At first, I was relieved to see headlights in my rearview mirror, thinking that I had finally encountered another driver on this isolated road. But as the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was an old pickup truck that looked like it was from the 1970s or 1980s. The truck was in pristine condition, as if it had just rolled off a showroom floor, but the design was clearly from decades ago. The truck followed me for several miles, maintaining a consistent distance behind my car. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it matched my speed exactly. I tried changing lanes to let it pass, but there was only one lane in each direction on this highway, so that was not possible. More vehicles began appearing both behind me and in the oncoming lane. There was a sedan from the 1960s, a station wagon that looked like it was from the 1950s, and even what appeared to be a Model T Ford from the early 1900s. All of the vehicles were in perfect condition despite their obvious age, and all of them had drivers who seemed to be staring directly at me as they passed. The drivers themselves looked wrong somehow. They were wearing clothing that matched the era of their vehicles, but their faces were pale and expressionless in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. None of them seemed to be looking at the road ahead of them. Instead, they all turned their heads to watch me as they drove by, their eyes never blinking or moving away from my car. I tried using my cell phone to call for help, but there was no signal anywhere along this highway. This was extremely unusual because cell coverage in Ohio is generally excellent, even in rural areas. I also tried using my car's emergency assistance system, but it could not establish a connection to the monitoring service. The road began to look different as well. The pavement started showing signs of age and wear that had not been there earlier in my drive. The lane markings became faded and unclear, and the guardrails along the roadside changed from modern metal barriers to old wooden posts and wire fencing. Most disturbing of all, I began to see signs along the roadside that did not make sense. There were billboards advertising businesses that had gone out of existence decades ago, using logos and slogans that I recognized from old photographs and history books. Gas station signs showed prices that had not been valid since the 1970s, and restaurant advertisements promoted menu items and prices from a bygone era. I realized that I was not driving on a normal highway in present-day Ohio. Somehow, I had ended up on a road that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, populated by drivers from different decades who were all traveling toward unknown destinations. The other drivers began to behave more aggressively as I continued down this impossible highway. They would pull alongside my car and pace me for miles, their passengers pointing at me and making gestures that I could not understand. Some of them seemed to be trying to force me to pull over, swerving toward my lane and honking their horns in patterns that sounded like they were trying to communicate something. I kept driving, hoping that I would eventually find an exit or intersection that would allow me to get off this highway and back to familiar roads. But every mile that passed brought more vintage vehicles and more bizarre signs of temporal displacement. I saw road construction crews using equipment from the 1930s, hitchhikers wearing clothing from various decades, and even horse-drawn carriages sharing the road with automobiles. After what felt like hours of driving, I saw a sign ahead that read, "Welcome to Millfield, founded 1823, population 2,847. I had never heard of any town called Millfield in Ohio, and the sign looked like it had been painted recently, despite referencing a founding date from the early 1800s. The exit for Millfield appeared to be my only option for getting off this nightmare highway. I took the exit and found myself driving through what appeared to be a small town from the early 20th century. The buildings were all period-appropriate architecture, the streetlights were old-fashioned gas lamps, and the few people I could see walking on the sidewalks were dressed in clothing from various historical periods. In the town center, I found a gas station that looked like it was from the 1950s, complete with full-service pumps and an attendant wearing a uniform from that era. I pulled up to the pumps, desperately hoping that someone could give me directions back to a highway I recognized. The attendant approached my car with a friendly smile and asked if I needed gas. When I explained that I was lost and trying to get back to the main interstate, his expression changed to one of concern and sympathy. He told me that many travelers ended up in Millfield by accident, and that getting back to the outside roads was not always easy. He explained that the highway I had been driving on was called the Eternal Route, and that it connected different periods of time rather than different geographic locations. Drivers who ended up on the Eternal Route were usually people who were at crossroads in their lives, facing important decisions or dealing with unresolved issues from their past. The attendant said that the only way to get back to normal roads was to understand why I had been drawn to the Eternal Route in the first place. He asked me about recent events in my life, and I found myself telling him about the supernatural experience I had shared with Jackson and Camden in the desert 3 years earlier. I explained how that encounter had changed my perspective on reality and left me questioning things that I had always taken for granted. I had been struggling with anxiety and depression since returning from that trip, and I had been avoiding close relationships because I was afraid of putting other people in danger. The attendant listened carefully to my story and then nodded knowingly. He said that survivors of supernatural encounters often found themselves drawn to the Eternal Route because they were searching for answers or trying to escape from memories that they could not process. The highway offered a temporary refuge from normal reality, but staying on it permanently meant giving up any chance of moving forward with life. He told me that if I wanted to return to the present day, I needed to accept what had happened in the desert and find a way to integrate that experience into my understanding of the world. Running away from supernatural encounters or trying to pretend they never happened would only lead to more encounters with things that existed outside normal reality. The attendant gave me specific directions for getting back to a highway that would take me home, but he warned me that the route would only work if I was genuinely ready to face my fears and move forward with my life. If I was still trying to escape or deny what I had experienced, I would end up back on the Eternal Route again. I thanked him for his help and followed his directions carefully. The road he directed me to looked normal and modern, with proper signage and contemporary vehicles. Within an hour, I was back on familiar highways and heading toward Columbus. When I arrived home, I discovered that according to all the clocks in my house, I had only been gone for about 3 hours total, which was exactly how long the original drive should have taken. It was as if my detour through the Eternal Route had occurred outside of normal time, allowing me to return to the present moment without losing any actual time. The experience on the Ghost Highway forced me to confront the fact that I had been living in denial about what happened in the desert. I had been trying to convince myself that the supernatural encounter was just a hallucination or misunderstanding, rather than accepting that there are aspects of reality that cannot be explained by conventional logic. Over the following weeks, I began seeking therapy to help me process both the desert experience and my night on the eternal route. I also reconnected with Jackson and Camden, and we started talking openly about how our supernatural encounter had affected each of us. We realized that we had all been struggling with similar issues related to accepting the reality of what we had witnessed. Working through these issues with professional help and the support of friends who had shared the same experience made a significant difference in my mental health and overall outlook on life. I learned that trying to suppress or deny traumatic experiences, even supernatural ones, only gives them more power to control your thoughts and behavior. I never encountered the eternal route again after that night in November. I believe this is because I finally accepted that there are mysteries in the world that cannot be fully understood or explained, and that encountering the supernatural does not necessarily mean that you are going crazy or that your life is doomed to be dominated by fear. The Ghost Highway taught me that running away from difficult experiences, whether natural or supernatural, ultimately leads to becoming lost in ways that are far more dangerous than facing those experiences directly. Sometimes the scariest journey is the one that leads back to normal life, because it requires acknowledging that normal life includes encounters with things that challenge our basic assumptions about reality. Today, I work as a consultant helping other people who have survived supernatural encounters or unexplained experiences. Many of them have found themselves drawn to isolated roads, abandoned buildings, or other liminal spaces where the boundaries between different realities seem thinner. By sharing my story about the eternal route, I try to help them understand that healing requires integration rather than escape. The supernatural is real, but it does not have to control your life. Sometimes the most important journey is the one that brings you back home to yourself, even if that journey takes you through places that exist outside the normal rules of time and space. My name is Camden, and what happened to me on a mountain highway in Colorado during the winter of 2023 still haunts my dreams every single night. At 27 years old, I was working as a regional sales manager for an industrial equipment company, which meant I spent a lot of time driving between different cities and client locations. I had always enjoyed the solitude and independence that came with highway driving, but this experience taught me that some roads are haunted by tragedies from the past. It was a Thursday evening in February when I left Denver to drive to a client meeting in Grand Junction, scheduled for early Friday morning. The weather forecast had called for light snow, but nothing that would make driving dangerous for someone with my experience handling Colorado mountain roads. My company truck was a well-maintained 2021 Ford F-150 with four-wheel drive and winter tires, perfect for navigating the challenging terrain of Interstate 70 through the Rockies. I left Denver around 6 o'clock in the evening, planning to drive the approximately 4 hours to Grand Junction and spend the night at a hotel near my client's facility. The first 2 hours of the drive went smoothly, with light traffic and only occasional snow flurries that did not affect visibility or road conditions. I was making excellent time and expected to arrive in Grand Junction well before 10 o'clock. That changed when I reached the mountain passes west of Vail. The snow began falling much more heavily than the weather service had predicted, and visibility dropped dramatically within a matter of minutes. What had been a routine winter drive suddenly became a white-knuckle experience as I navigated winding mountain roads with steep drops on one side and rock faces on the other. The wind was howling through the mountain peaks, creating snow drifts that made it difficult to see lane markers and road signs. I slowed down to about 35 miles per hour and turned on my hazard flashers, following the taillights of a few other vehicles that were also struggling with the deteriorating conditions. Most of the traffic had either pulled off at exits to wait out the storm or had taken alternate routes, leaving only a handful of vehicles on the highway. Around 9 o'clock, I was climbing a particularly steep grade when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. The lights were much larger and brighter than those of a typical passenger vehicle, suggesting that a large truck was approaching from behind. This was not unusual on Interstate 70, which is a major freight corridor, but something about these particular headlights made me uneasy. The truck was gaining on me rapidly, despite the dangerous road conditions. It was traveling much faster than was safe for the weather, and it seemed to be getting closer to my rear bumper with every passing second. I moved into the right lane to let it pass, but instead of going around me, the truck slowed down to match my speed and remained directly behind me. Through my mirrors, I could see that it was a massive 18-wheeler, probably a Peterbilt or Kenworth from the 1980s or 1990s. The truck was dark-colored, possibly black or dark blue, and it had additional lights mounted on the cab and trailer that created an almost blinding glare in my mirrors. The driver seemed to be deliberately positioning the truck to illuminate the interior of my vehicle with those powerful lights. For the next 20 miles, the truck followed me with unnerving persistence. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I changed lanes, it followed me into the new lane and resumed its position just a few feet behind my rear bumper. The driver never attempted to pass, never responded to my hand gestures, and never backed off to a safe following distance. I tried using my CB radio to contact the truck driver, but received no response on any channel. I also tried flashing my brake lights and turning my hazard flashers on and off in patterns that truckers typically use to communicate, but the driver behind me showed no acknowledgement of my attempts to establish contact. As we approached the Eisenhower Tunnel, the longest vehicle tunnel in North America, I decided to pull off at the last exit before the tunnel entrance. I wanted to get away from this aggressive driver and wait for him to continue on his route before resuming my own journey. The truck followed me off the highway and into the parking area of a closed rest stop. I parked under a street light and got out of my vehicle to confront the truck driver about his dangerous tailgating behavior. But as I walked toward the truck, I realized that something was very wrong with what I was seeing. The truck appeared to be empty. I could see clearly into the cab through the windshield and side windows, and there was no driver visible anywhere inside the vehicle. The engine was running, the lights were on, and the truck was idling normally, but there was absolutely no one behind the wheel. I walked completely around the truck, checking every angle and looking for any sign of where the driver might be. The doors were closed and appeared to be locked. The sleeper cab was dark and empty, and there were no footprints in the snow around the vehicle to indicate that anyone had gotten out recently. Feeling increasingly frightened and confused, I returned to my own truck and tried calling 911 on my cell phone. But I discovered that I had no signal at all in this location, which was unusual because most areas along Interstate 70 have good cellular coverage due to the heavy traffic volume. As I sat in my truck trying to decide what to do next, the phantom 18-wheeler began moving again. It pulled out of the parking area and drove back toward the highway on-ramp, still with no visible driver in the cab. I watched in disbelief as this massive vehicle navigated the turns and acceleration lanes with no human input that I could detect. I decided to continue my trip to Grand Junction, hoping that I would not encounter the phantom truck again. But as soon as I re-entered the highway and began driving toward the tunnel, the mysterious 18-wheeler appeared behind me once more, resuming its aggressive following behavior as if nothing had happened. This pattern continued for the next hour. The truck would tailgate me dangerously close, forcing me to drive faster than was safe for the conditions. Occasionally, it would pull alongside me in the left lane, and I could see clearly that the cab was empty, with no driver visible anywhere inside the vehicle. The most terrifying moment came when we were descending a steep grade about 30 miles east of Grand Junction. The phantom truck pulled into the left lane and began trying to force me off the road by gradually moving into my lane. I could see the massive trailer getting closer and closer to the side of my truck, and I realized that if I did not take evasive action, I was going to be crushed against the guardrail. I accelerated and managed to get ahead of the phantom truck, but it immediately began pursuing me again, this time at speeds that were absolutely reckless for the snowy mountain conditions. I was driving nearly 70 miles per hour on a winding downhill section of highway, with the ghost truck's headlights filling my mirrors and its air horn blasting constantly behind me. That was when I remembered something I had heard about trucking accidents on this particular stretch of highway. About 15 years earlier, there had been a major accident involving an 18-wheeler that lost its brakes on this same downhill grade. The truck had crashed through the guardrail and fallen into a deep ravine, killing the driver instantly. The accident had been big news at the time because it led to new safety regulations for commercial vehicles in mountain areas. I realized that the phantom truck that was pursuing me might be the ghost of that fatal accident, somehow continuing to drive the same route where the original driver had died. The truck was trying to cause another accident at the exact location where the original crash had occurred, possibly attempting to recreate the circumstances of the driver's death. As we approached the curve where the historical accident had taken place, I made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing straight on the highway where the phantom truck seemed to be trying to force me to crash, I took an exit that I knew led to a small town called Rifle. The exit ramp was steep and icy, but it offered my only chance to escape from whatever was pursuing me. The phantom truck followed me onto the exit ramp, but as we descended toward the town, something strange began to happen. The truck started to become less solid and visible, as if it were fading away like a mirage. The headlights grew dimmer, the sound of the diesel engine became quieter, and the massive vehicle began to look transparent. By the time I reached the bottom of the exit ramp, the phantom truck had completely disappeared. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop and sat there for nearly an hour, trying to process what I had just experienced. Other truckers and travelers were coming and going normally, and everything looked completely ordinary and peaceful. I asked several people at the truck stop if they had seen a large, dark-colored 18-wheeler in the area, but no one had noticed anything unusual. The clerk at the fuel desk told me that the highway patrol had not reported any incidents or problems on Interstate 70 that evening, and that traffic conditions were normal despite the snow. When I continued my drive to Grand Junction, I encountered no further problems. The phantom truck did not reappear, and I arrived at my hotel without any additional incidents. But I spent most of the night researching the trucking accident that I remembered hearing about, and I found detailed newspaper reports that confirmed my recollections. The original accident had occurred almost exactly 15 years earlier during a snowstorm very similar to the one I had encountered. The truck driver, a man named Robert Martinez, had been hauling electronic equipment from Denver to California when his brakes failed on the same steep grade where the phantom truck had tried to force me off the road. According to the accident reports, Martinez had tried desperately to stop his runaway truck by using emergency techniques like downshifting and using the truck's jake brake. But the weight of his cargo and the icy road conditions made it impossible to regain control. The truck had crashed through the guardrail at nearly 80 miles per hour and fallen more than 200 feet into the ravine below. What made the story even more disturbing was that Martinez had been driving the same model and color of truck that I had seen pursuing me on the highway. The newspaper photos of the wrecked vehicle looked exactly like the phantom truck, down to the specific arrangement of lights on the cab and trailer. I also discovered that I was not the first person to report encounters with a phantom truck on that section of Interstate 70. Over the past 15 years, at least a dozen other drivers had reported being followed or harassed by a driverless 18-wheeler in the same area where Martinez had died. Most of these reports had been dismissed by authorities as hallucinations caused by fatigue or stress, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. Several of the witnesses had reported that the phantom truck seemed to be trying to cause accidents at the same location where the original crash had occurred. Some drivers had been forced off the road, while others had managed to escape by taking exits or pulling into rest areas. In every case, the phantom truck had disappeared once the witness left the main highway. I believe that the ghost of Robert Martinez is still trying to complete his final delivery, unaware that he died in the accident 15 years ago. The phantom truck appears during snowstorms, similar to the conditions that existed on the night of the original crash, and it targets other drivers who are traveling the same route that Martinez was following when he died. The experience left me with a profound respect for the dangers of mountain driving and a new understanding of how tragic accidents can leave spiritual imprints that persist for years or even decades. I still drive Interstate 70 for business purposes, but I'm much more careful about checking weather conditions and avoiding travel during severe storms. I have also started carrying additional safety equipment in my truck, including emergency communication devices and survival supplies that would help me if I ever found myself stranded in a remote mountain location. Most importantly, I have learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong during a drive, even if I cannot immediately explain what is causing my uneasiness. The phantom truck taught me that the highways we travel every day are more than just transportation corridors. They are places where human dramas have played out, where tragedies have occurred, and where the echoes of past events sometimes intrude on the present in ways that challenge our understanding of reality. Robert Martinez died trying to save other drivers from being hurt by his runaway truck, and I believe his spirit continues that mission in death, albeit in a twisted way that recreates the very danger he tried to prevent. The phantom truck serves as both a warning and a reminder that the roads we take for granted are built on a foundation of countless human stories, some of which refuse to be forgotten. Every time I drive through that section of Colorado now, I remember Robert Martinez and the night his phantom truck nearly forced me to join him in whatever realm exists beyond the physical highway. It is a reminder that we are never truly alone on the road, and that the past has a way of reasserting itself when conditions are right for the boundaries between life and death to become permeable. My name is Jackson, and this is the final story I need to tell about my encounters with the supernatural along America's highways. After surviving that nightmare with the skinwalker in the desert, I thought I had experienced the worst that the road could throw at me. I was wrong. In December of 2023, 3 years after that first terrifying encounter, I found myself trapped in a situation that challenged everything I thought I knew about time, space, and reality itself. I was driving from Cleveland to Chicago for a job interview at a marketing firm that could potentially change my career trajectory. At 26 years old, I had been working in digital marketing for several years, but this opportunity represented a significant step up in terms of both responsibility and compensation. The interview was scheduled for Monday morning, so I planned to drive out on Sunday and spend the night at a hotel near their offices. The drive from Cleveland to Chicago is straightforward under normal circumstances, about 5.5 hours of mostly interstate highway travel. I left home around 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, planning to arrive in Chicago with plenty of time to find my hotel, get a good dinner, and prepare for the interview. My car was the same reliable Honda Civic I had been driving since college, and I'd made this trip several times before without any problems. The weather was cold but clear, with light traffic that made for easy driving through Ohio and Indiana. I was making excellent time and feeling optimistic about both the interview and my chances of landing the position. The hiring manager had been enthusiastic during our phone conversations, and I felt confident that my experience and portfolio would make a strong impression. About 4 hours into the drive, somewhere in northern Indiana, I started feeling tired and decided to stop for coffee and a quick break. I had been seeing billboards for a rest area called Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza for the past 50 miles, and it seemed like the perfect place to stretch my legs and refuel for the final hour of driving to Chicago. The rest area was one of those modern facilities designed to serve both regular travelers and commercial truckers. It had multiple buildings, including a large convenience store, several fast food restaurants, fuel stations for both cars and trucks, and extensive parking areas. The place appeared busy but not crowded, with a steady flow of travelers coming and going. I parked near the main building and went inside to use the restroom and buy a large coffee. The facility was well maintained and brightly lit, with the kind of generic corporate atmosphere that characterizes most highway rest stops. There were families with children, truck drivers grabbing quick meals, and business travelers like myself taking breaks during long drives. After getting my coffee and using the restroom, I walked back to my car and checked my phone for messages. The time showed 6:47 p.m., which meant I would arrive in Chicago right around 8 o'clock as planned. I got back in my car and drove toward the rest area exit, ready to complete the final leg of my journey. That was when I noticed that something was wrong with the exit. Instead of leading back to the interstate highway I had been traveling on, the exit ramp seemed to curve back toward the rest area parking lot. I found myself driving in a loop that brought me right back to where I'd started, pulling up to the same parking space I had just left. Confused and slightly frustrated, I parked again and got out to look around. The rest area appeared exactly as it had before, with the same people moving around the parking lot and the same vehicles in the same locations. It was as if no time had passed at all since my previous stop. I checked my phone, and the time still showed 6:47 p.m. I walked back into the main building, thinking that perhaps I had made a wrong turn or missed a sign that would direct me to the correct exit. But when I asked the clerk at the information desk for directions to Interstate 80, he looked at me strangely and said there was no Interstate 80 in the area. He insisted that the only highway near the rest area was State Route 49, which I had never heard of. I showed him my GPS, which clearly indicated that I was supposed to be at a rest area along Interstate 80, but the device now showed no signal and could not determine my current location. This was impossible because GPS works everywhere in the continental United States, and I had been using it successfully throughout my drive. Feeling increasingly anxious, I went back to my car and tried driving toward what I thought was the correct exit. But once again, the road curved back toward the rest area, and I found myself pulling into the same parking space for the third time. My phone still showed 6:47 p.m., and everything around me appeared exactly as it had during my first visit. I began to realize that I was trapped in some kind of time loop, endlessly repeating the same few minutes at this rest area. Every time I tried to leave, I ended up back where I started, with the clock frozen at the same moment and the same people going through the same motions around me. To test this theory, I went back inside and approached a family with 2 young children who had been standing near the food court during all 3 of my visits. I asked them if they had been at the rest area for very long, and the father said they had just arrived and were planning to grab some dinner before continuing their trip to visit relatives. I went outside and waited for 20 minutes, then came back inside to find the exact same family standing in the exact same location, having the exact same conversation about grabbing dinner. When I approached them again, the father gave me the identical response he had given before, word for word, with the same inflection and gestures. Over the next several hours, I tried dozens of different approaches to escape from the time loop. I attempted to drive in different directions, tried calling for help on my cell phone, asked other travelers for assistance, and even tried walking away from the rest area on foot. Nothing worked. Every action I took eventually led me back to the same parking space at 6:47 p.m., surrounded by the same people repeating the same behaviors. The other travelers at the rest area seemed to be unaware that anything unusual was happening. They went through their routines of buying food, using restrooms, and preparing to continue their journeys, but they never actually left. They would walk toward their vehicles, get inside, and then simply reset to their original positions and start the process over again. I began to pay closer attention to the other people at the rest area, looking for clues about what might be causing this supernatural phenomenon. That was when I started noticing details that I had missed during my first few loops through the experience. Some of the travelers were wearing clothing from different time periods. There was a man in a business suit that looked like it was from the 1980s, a woman wearing a dress that appeared to be from the 1960s, and even a family whose clothing and hairstyles suggested they were from the 1950s. All of these people seemed to be from different decades, but they were all trapped in the same repeating loop at this rest area. I also noticed that many of the vehicles in the parking lot were vintage models that should not still be on the road. There were cars from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, all in perfect condition despite their age. It was as if the rest area existed outside of normal time, collecting travelers from different eras and trapping them in an endless repetition of their final moments before continuing their journeys. After what felt like days of being trapped in the same few minutes, I decided to explore the rest area more thoroughly, looking for any clues about its history or the cause of the time loop. In the back of the main building, I found a small museum display about the history of the area. According to the display, the rest area had been built on the site of a tragic bus accident that occurred in 1987. A Greyhound bus carrying 37 passengers had crashed during a severe thunderstorm, killing everyone on board. The victims had been traveling from various cities across the Midwest, all bound for different destinations when their journey ended at this location. The museum display included photographs of the accident scene and biographical information about the victims. As I read through the list of names and ages, I realized that many of the people I had been seeing at the rest area matched the descriptions of those who had died in the bus crash. The family from the 1950s, the businessman from the 1980s, the woman in the 1960s dress. They were all passengers who had been killed in that accident 36 years ago. They were trapped in an eternal loop, forever preparing to continue journeys that would never be completed. I understood that I had somehow become caught in the same supernatural trap that had been holding these victims for decades. The rest area existed as a kind of purgatory, where the dead continued to go through the motions of travel without ever reaching their destinations. But I also realized that unlike the other travelers, I was still alive, and therefore might be able to break free from the loop if I could figure out how to help the trapped souls find peace. They were stuck because they had died suddenly and violently without completing their journeys or saying goodbye to the people they were traveling to see. I spent the next several loops talking to different travelers, learning their stories and trying to understand what they needed in order to move on. The businessman was traveling to Chicago for his daughter's wedding. The woman in the 1960s dress was going to visit her sick mother. The family from the 1950s was moving to a new city where the father had found work. I began helping these lost souls acknowledge that they had died and that their earthly journeys were over. I told them about the bus accident and explained that they had been trapped at this location for decades, unable to accept their deaths and move on to whatever comes after life. One by one, the travelers began to fade away as they accepted the truth about their situation and found the peace they needed to continue their spiritual journey. The businessman realized that his daughter would have gotten married without him and that she had lived a full life. The woman understood that her mother had passed away long ago and was probably waiting for her on the other side. As each soul found peace and departed, the rest area became less crowded, and the time loop began to weaken. The clock on my phone started moving again, first by seconds, then by minutes. The modern world began to reassert itself as the supernatural influence of the trapped souls diminished. When the last of the bus crash victims finally accepted their fate and moved on, the time loop collapsed entirely. I found myself sitting in my car at 8:23 p.m., nearly 2 hours after I had first stopped at the rest area. The place looked normal now, with contemporary travelers going about their business, and no trace of the vintage cars or period clothing I had been seeing. I was able to drive away without any problems, and I reached my hotel in Chicago just before 10 o'clock. The interview went well the next morning, and I was offered the position, though I decided to decline because the experience at the rest area had given me a new perspective on what was really important in life. I researched the bus accident extensively after returning home, and I found that the rest area had been built as a memorial to the victims, though most travelers were unaware of its tragic history. I also discovered that I was not the first person to report strange experiences at that location. Though most people dismissed these accounts as urban legends or ghost stories, I believe that the rest area served as a kind of supernatural holding pattern for souls who died suddenly while traveling, unable to accept their deaths and move on to whatever comes next. By helping these trapped spirits find peace, I was able to break the cycle that had been repeating for decades and free both them and myself from the time loop. The experience taught me that some locations hold on to dramatic events so strongly that they create pockets of distorted reality where the past refuses to let go of the present. Highways and rest areas, which see thousands of travelers every day, sometimes become focal points for these supernatural phenomena when tragedy occurs. I still travel frequently for work, but I'm much more aware of the history and energy of the places where I stop. Some locations carry the weight of past events in ways that can affect sensitive individuals, and it is important to approach these places with respect for the human stories they contain. The souls I helped that night at the rest area had been trapped for over 30 years, reliving the same few minutes before their deaths in the bus crash. By acknowledging their stories and helping them understand that their time on Earth was over, I was able to give them the closure they needed to continue their spiritual journey. Today, that rest area operates normally, serving thousands of travelers every month without any reports of supernatural activity. The time loop has been broken, and the victims of the 1987 bus crash are finally at peace. But I will never forget the night I spent trapped outside of time, learning that sometimes the greatest service we can provide to the dead is simply helping them understand that it is time to let go and move on. The highway between Cleveland and Chicago is just a road now, but for one night it became a bridge between life and death, past and present, holding and healing. And sometimes, when I drive past that rest area on business trips, I say a quiet prayer for all the travelers who never made it to their destinations, grateful that I was able to help some of them find their way home.